A wooden vessel is asked to carry the memory of the world through catastrophe. Every animal, every future species, every fragile breath of life is compressed into one sacred story that many were taught to defend as history. Hume would not begin by laughing at the story. He would ask something colder. What evidence could possibly outweigh the enormous improbability of such a claim? The question is not whether the story of Noah is beautiful. It clearly is. The question is not whether it carries moral weight or emotional power. Generations of believers have found in it a portrait of divine mercy in the middle of divine wrath, and that tension is genuinely moving. The real question, the one that sits beneath the surface of Sunday school lessons and creationist museums, is whether the Ark story can survive contact with something colder and more demanding than devotion. Can it survive contact with evidence? When you hold the story of Noah's Ark to the standard that any extraordinary historical claim must meet, something begins to fracture. Not the beauty, not the meaning, something else. The literal scaffolding that a specific tradition built around it, the structure that insists the ark was a real vessel, that the flood covered every mountain, that every species of animal boarded and survived, and that this event is recoverable as physical history. That structure is what this investigation is about. Not faith, not spirituality. The specific, verifiable, evidential claim. And the philosopher who gave us the most precise instrument for examining that claim died in 1776, long before modern biology or geology could sharpen his argument even further. David Hume was an 18th century Scottish philosopher who is widely regarded as one of the most rigorous thinkers in the Western tradition. He did not wear his skepticism like a weapon. He wore it like a surgical instrument. Hume was deeply interested in the question of how human beings form beliefs, what makes testimony reliable, and what happens when a claim requires us to believe in something that violates nearly everything we understand about how the world operates. His essay on miracles, published as part of his Inquiry Concerning Human Understanding, remains one of the most precise and demanding challenges ever written to the logic of extraordinary religious claims. What made Hume dangerous was not that he denied the possibility of the miraculous outright. He was more careful than that. He argued that before accepting any claim as true, a rational person must weigh the evidence for it against the evidence against it, and that the graver the claim, the more powerful the evidence must be. A miracle, by definition, is a violation of the laws of nature that have been confirmed by the uniform experience of humanity. For such a claim, Hume argued, the evidence required is not just strong. It must be so overwhelming that the alternative, that the witnesses were mistaken, deceived, or themselves deceiving, becomes less probable than the miracle itself. That is an extraordinarily high bar, and the Ark story, when placed beneath it, does not clear it easily. In the tradition that millions inherited, the story of Noah is not a poem. It is a record. God observes that humanity has become irredeemably corrupt. Violence has filled the earth. The divine response is total. God decides to unmake what was made, to return the world to formless water, and to begin again with one man who was found righteous, a man named Noah. The instruction God gives Noah is precise and architectural. Build a vessel of a specific length, width, and height. Seal it with pitch. Bring aboard your family, and bring aboard representatives of every living creature. 7 pairs of the clean animals, and 1 pair of the unclean, so that life may survive what is about to be erased. The flood that follows is not a regional disaster in the traditional telling. It is cosmic. The waters rise above the highest mountains. Every living thing on the surface of the earth that breathes air dies. The earth is effectively reset. For 40 days and 40 nights the rain falls, and then the waters take additional months to recede. Noah sends out birds to test the air. A dove returns with an olive branch. Land is near. The ark comes to rest on a mountain, and the survivors descend into a world that is empty and waiting. God speaks again, this time not in judgment, but in covenant. Never again. And as a sign of that promise, a rainbow appears in the sky. This is the doctrine as it was given to hundreds of millions of people. It was given not as allegory, not as inspired poetry in the tradition of wisdom literature, but as a foundational historical event. In the framework of young earth creationism and biblical literalism, the flood is the explanation for the fossil record, for geological strata, for the distribution of species across the globe. The ark is not symbolic, it is the most important vessel in human history. And Noah is not a mythic archetype. He is a real man whose carpentry and obedience preserved all life on earth. The story of Noah felt sacred for reasons that go far deeper than doctrine. For most people who encountered it, the first meeting came in childhood, which means it arrived before the critical faculties were fully formed, embedded in the warm authority of a parent's voice or a teacher's story. The animals 2 by 2, that image is almost universally recognizable. There is something tender and almost playful about it, this parade of creatures filing into shelter while the sky prepares to fall. Even before theology enters, the story reaches something primal: shelter, survival, the preservation of the innocent. The moral architecture of the story also carries tremendous emotional power. The idea that one person's righteousness can matter enough to save the world is not a small idea. It is a profound statement about moral significance, about the possibility that how a single human being lives their life has cosmic consequences. For communities where meaning is tied to personal obedience and divine relationship, this is not merely comforting. It is foundational. Noah becomes a model. You may be surrounded by corruption, the story says, but your faithfulness counts. That is not a trivial message. It is one that has sustained people through genuine suffering. And then there is the covenant. After the destruction, after the grief of all that loss, God promises restraint. The rainbow is given as a sign, not to humanity from God, but apparently as a reminder to God of the divine promise. Something about that detail is strangely intimate. The universe itself is asked to remember mercy. For people who experienced life as precarious, for ancient communities living at the mercy of flood and drought and famine, the promise behind the rainbow was not sentimental, it was existential. The world would not be ended again. That promise, wrapped in color after a storm, is one of the most emotionally resonant images in all of religious literature. Its power is real, even if the questions about its history are uncomfortable. Here is what the emotional power of a story does not prove. It does not prove the story is a literal record. This is not a cynical observation. It is simply an honest one. Human beings are capable of creating stories that carry profound truth, genuine moral insight, and deep psychological resonance without those stories being transcripts of physical events. Every great tradition of literature demonstrates this. Tragedy, myth, parable, and sacred narrative have always had the capacity to transmit real meaning through constructed form. The question is not whether Noah's Ark is powerful. It clearly is. The question is whether its power depends on its literal accuracy, and whether that literal accuracy can actually be defended. The first crack in the literalist reading does not come from atheism. It does not come from hostility to religion. It comes from something far more neutral, a simple willingness to ask what the story actually requires if taken as physical history. How large was the vessel? The text gives specific measurements in cubits, which translates to roughly 450 feet in length by some calculations. How many species existed? How much food was needed? How was waste managed for a voyage of many months? What happened to freshwater fish when the seas flooded with rain? What happened to saltwater fish when the ocean diluted? These are not trick questions. They are the questions that arise naturally the moment a sacred story is asked to function as geography and biology rather than as theology and myth. The sacred power of the story does not disappear when these questions are asked. What disappears is the comfort of never having asked them. And that disappearance, for many people who were raised in traditions that treated the Ark as history, is one of the most quietly destabilizing moments in a person's intellectual and spiritual life. If this story, told with such confidence, with museum exhibits and children's books and Sunday school crafts, cannot survive a straightforward examination of its logistics, what does that mean for everything else? If you have found this investigation useful so far, pressing the like button now helps this channel continue doing exactly this kind of work, because there is much more to examine, and the questions only grow more serious from here. The story of Noah does not appear in a vacuum. It arrives inside a long, ancient, and deeply layered tradition of flood mythology that stretches across the ancient Near East and far beyond. Long before the Hebrew text of Genesis was written in its current form, flood stories were circulating in Mesopotamia, the cultural world that shared borders, language families, trade routes, and religious concepts with ancient Israel. The Sumerian king list, a document of remarkable antiquity, refers to a great flood that interrupted the reign of kings. The Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the oldest surviving works of literature in human history, contains a flood narrative so structurally similar to the Genesis account that when it was first translated in the 19th century, it caused a genuine crisis in some religious communities. In the Gilgamesh version, the flood hero is named Utnapishtim. He is warned by a god that a divine council has decided to destroy humanity. He is instructed to build a great vessel. He brings his family aboard, along with craftsmen and animals. The rains fall. The waters cover the land. The boat eventually comes to rest on a mountain. He releases birds, including a dove and a raven, to test whether land has dried. He offers sacrifices when the flood ends. He is granted a kind of immortality as a reward for his survival. The structural parallels between this story and the Genesis account of Noah are not superficial. They are precise enough that scholars have debated for more than a century whether the biblical account drew from Mesopotamian sources, whether both drew from a shared older tradition, or whether both independently encoded memories of actual regional flooding events in the ancient world. What this history reveals is that the Noah story participates in a genre, not that it is merely plagiarized. Ancient societies across the Near East, and indeed across many parts of the world, passed down flood traditions as a way of encoding profound human fears about cosmic destruction, divine displeasure, and the fragility of civilization. These stories served a theological and cultural function that was understood by their original audiences as operating differently from what we would now call journalistic history. They were not lies. They were a different mode of truth-telling, one that encodes meaning through narrative rather than through what the modern world would recognize as documented fact. The oral traditions that eventually became written scripture passed through many hands, many centuries, and many political and religious contexts before arriving in the form we now have. The Hebrew text of Genesis was shaped by editors and scribes working in specific historical circumstances, including the Babylonian exile, a period when Israel was in direct cultural contact with Mesopotamia, and when questions of identity, divine faithfulness, and the meaning of catastrophe were urgently alive. Understanding this does not require dismissing the text. It requires reading the text with the full awareness of what kind of text it was and where it came from. The ancient world did not draw the same sharp line between what we would call myth and what we would call history. Sacred narratives were expected to carry truth, but the truth they carried was theological, moral, and communal. They answered questions like, why does the world contain suffering? What does divine justice look like? How do human beings relate to a power greater than themselves? These are real questions. The stories built to answer them are not frauds, but they were never designed to function as geological records or biological inventories, and treating them as such imposes a modern demand on an ancient form of wisdom that the original storytellers would not have recognized. The literal reading of the Ark story did not emerge simply from a neutral reading of an ancient text. It emerged from a specific set of institutional needs and theological commitments that required the text to function as history. Understanding who needed that reading and why is not an act of cynicism. It is an act of historical honesty. The first and most significant pressure came from the doctrine of biblical inerrancy, the belief that Scripture, being divinely inspired, cannot contain factual error. If the Bible is without error in all that it affirms, then the Ark story must have happened. Not symbolically, not poetically, literally, because the text presents it in a form that, on a certain reading, appears to intend literal description. Affirming the literal reading becomes a theological necessity, not merely a historical preference. Once that commitment is in place, a great deal flows from it. Institutions built around biblical inerrancy, seminaries, denominations, publishing houses, educational networks, museums, political advocacy organizations, have a genuine institutional stake in defending the literal reading. This is not a conspiracy. It is simply the natural behavior of institutions when their foundational premises are threatened. If the Ark story is symbolic, then the question of what else in Scripture might be symbolic becomes unavoidable. And for traditions that have structured their entire theological architecture on the premise that Scripture is factual from the first verse, that question is genuinely destabilizing. The creationist movement, which rose to particular prominence in the 20th century in the United States, found in the Ark story a key doctrinal battleground. Young Earth creationism requires a global flood because a global flood provides a mechanism for the geological and biological evidence that mainstream science attributes to deep time and evolution. The fossil record, in this framework, is the record of mass death in the flood. The geological layers are flood deposits. The distribution of species across continents is explained by post-flood migration and speciation. The Ark therefore becomes not just a religious story, but a scientific theory in competition with geology, paleontology, and evolutionary biology. Its literal truth is not incidental, it is structural. The community identity dimension of this is equally significant. In many Christian communities, especially in the evangelical and fundamentalist traditions, the willingness to defend the literal Ark becomes a marker of loyalty. Questioning it is not just an intellectual divergence, it is a social signal. It suggests that the questioner may not be fully committed to Scripture, to the community's understanding of God, or to the shared identity of the group. The pressure to maintain the literal reading is therefore not simply theological. It is social, emotional, and communal. Leaving the literal reading behind can mean, for many people, risking their relationships, their standing in their community, and their sense of belonging. This is why the arc story is defended with such energy, even when the logical difficulties are apparent. The defense is not always primarily about the arc. It is about what defending the arc means. It means belonging. It means faithfulness. It means loyalty to an identity that runs deeper than any single story. Understanding this does not mean that the defenders of the literal reading are foolish or dishonest. It means that human beings, operating inside communities that give their lives meaning, do not always evaluate beliefs purely on evidential grounds. And that too is something Hume would have understood completely. The hidden contradiction at the heart of the literal arc reading is not subtle once you look for it. It is a contradiction between the theological ambition of the story and the physical requirements of making it literally true. The story, as a theological document, is trying to say something immense: that God is sovereign over creation, that justice and mercy exist in tension, that covenant relationship with the divine has cosmic stakes. These are ideas that do not require a boat of specific measurements carrying 2 of every insect species to be meaningful. But the moment the story is defended as literal history, it must bear the weight of those physical requirements. And that weight is crushing. Consider the scale of the animal logistics alone. Modern estimates of described species number in the millions, and that figure does not include the vast majority of species that likely remain undescribed. Even if we use conservative estimates and restrict the count to vertebrates only, the numbers are staggering. There are roughly 5,000 species of mammals, 10,000 species of birds, over 10,000 species of reptiles, and tens of thousands of species of fish. The text says, pairs of every kind were brought aboard, which creates an immediate question. What is a kind? Creationist interpreters often argue that Noah brought representatives of broader biological families rather than individual species, which would reduce the number, but then requires extraordinary post-flood speciation to explain the diversity we observe today, a rate of speciation that would itself be miraculous. The food requirements for such a voyage are another fracture point that does not resolve easily. Different animals require radically different diets. Carnivores require living or fresh prey. Many species have highly specialized dietary requirements that cannot be approximated by stored grain. The logistics of feeding, watering, and maintaining living animals of every size and ecological requirement for the duration of a voyage that the text describes as lasting many months falls outside what any natural reading of the physical constraints of the described vessel can accommodate. The volume of water alone required by large mammals is enormous, and the text provides no mechanism for its storage or replenishment. The geographic and ecological questions multiply further. Marsupials, for instance, are overwhelmingly concentrated in Australia. How did they get to the Ark from Australia, board it, survive the voyage, and then return to Australia without leaving a trace of their post-flood migration across the land masses they would have crossed? The same question applies to the unique fauna of island ecosystems, to the polar bears of the Arctic, to the species of the Amazon basin, to the endemic creatures of Madagascar, and to thousands of other geographically isolated populations. Each one of these questions is individually answerable with sufficiently creative theological argumentation, but together, they constitute something that Hume would recognize immediately. The cumulative probability of all of these special explanations being required simultaneously is not lower than the probability of the story being something other than literal history. It is higher. The contradiction, finally, is not between faith and science. It is between 2 kinds of reading: a reading that allows the story to function as mythic theology, as a profound statement about divine judgment, mercy, and covenant within a tradition of ancient sacred narrative, is internally coherent. A reading that insists the story is literal history must then bear the full weight of every physical, biological, geographical, and geological implication that follows, and that weight requires not one miracle, but an unbroken cascade of interventions with no physical trace. The tradition that tells you to defend the literal reading rarely tells you how many miracles that defense actually requires, and it never asks why a loving God would design a system of preservation so needlessly complicated when simpler alternatives were available to an omnipotent creator. David Hume's argument about miracles is one of the most carefully constructed pieces of philosophical reasoning in the history of Western thought. To understand it fully, you have to understand the foundation on which it rests. Hume was a philosopher deeply interested in the relationship between experience and belief. He argued that everything human beings know about the world, they know because of repeated experience. We know fire burns because we have experienced fire burning, and because no one has ever credibly reported experiencing fire that did not burn. The more uniform and universal our experience of a natural regularity, the more confident we are entitled to be in treating it as a law of nature. This is not arrogance. It is simply the rational structure of how knowledge accumulates. A miracle, by definition, is a violation of these accumulated regularities. It is not just an unusual event. It is an event that runs directly contrary to the entire body of human experience that has established how nature operates. Hume's argument is not that miracles are impossible in some metaphysical sense. He is not claiming to have access to knowledge about what God can or cannot do. His argument is epistemological. It is about how we should weigh testimony about alleged miracles against everything else we know. And his answer is precise. The evidence in favor of a miracle claim must be weighed against the evidence that the laws of nature, which the miracle supposedly violated, are indeed laws. And those laws are confirmed by the uniform experience of all of humanity across all of recorded history. That is an extremely heavy counterweight. Hume goes further. He identifies specific reasons why miracle testimony is particularly vulnerable to error. First, there is the problem of human psychology. Human beings are strongly drawn to the marvelous, to stories that exceed ordinary experience, and this draws them toward credulity about extraordinary events rather than skepticism. Second, there is the problem of cultural transmission. Stories gain embellishment as they pass through communities, particularly when those stories serve the interests of the community that carries them. Third, there is the problem of interest. Miracle reports tend to originate within communities that have a theological or institutional reason to want them to be true. Fourth, there is the problem of competing miracles. Every major religious tradition has its own miracle accounts, and accepting any one tradition's miracles as genuine without equally accepting the others requires a selective standard that needs its own justification. The rule that emerged from Hume's analysis has been summarized in a phrase that Hume himself did not quite write in this exact form, but which captures the spirit of his argument precisely. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. This is not a modern skeptic's bumper sticker. It is a rigorous epistemological principle. The more extraordinary a claim, the more a claim departs from the accumulated experience of humanity, the higher the evidential standard it must meet before a rational person is justified in accepting it. This principle does not prejudge the outcome. It simply refuses to grant special immunity from scrutiny to claims that wear the label of the sacred. Hume was also interested in the psychology of religious belief beyond just the logic of miracles. He explored how fear, hope, ignorance, and social pressure shape what people believe and how they believe it. He recognized that belief systems are not purely intellectual constructions. They are emotional, social, and cultural structures. This recognition makes his critique of miracle testimony more nuanced than it might first appear. Hume is not simply calling witnesses liars. He is pointing to the complex human environment in which testimony is generated, transmitted, and received, and noting that every element of that environment tends to favor the amplification of miracle reports, rather than their accurate assessment. What makes Hume's framework particularly powerful when applied to ancient religious texts is its patience. It does not require us to call the authors of Genesis frauds. It does not require us to say that the communities who transmitted the story were stupid. It simply asks us to remember that the testimony of ancient sources, filtered through centuries of oral transmission, cultural adaptation, institutional interest, and theological editing, must be weighed against the uniform experience of how nature operates. And when we weigh them honestly, the rational question is not whether God could theoretically have done what the Ark story describes. The rational question is whether the evidence that God did is stronger than the evidence that the story is something other than a literal historical account. For Hume, that is not even a close contest. When Hume's framework is applied directly to the Ark story, the examination becomes both methodical and devastating. Begin with the vessel itself. The Genesis text describes an ark approximately 450 feet long, 75 feet wide, and 45 feet high. This is a large structure by ancient standards, but modern naval engineering raises serious questions about its structural integrity. The largest wooden vessels ever constructed in the modern era, built with far more advanced knowledge of shipbuilding than was available in the ancient Near East, reached somewhere around 300 feet in length, before requiring iron bracing to prevent the hull from flexing and taking on water. A vessel of the dimensions described in Genesis, built from wood, exposed to the violent conditions of a global flood, would face extraordinary structural challenges that the text does not acknowledge. The animal logistics under Hume's scrutiny are even more demanding. Accepting the most conservative possible estimate of animal diversity, assuming that Noah carried only representatives of broader biological kinds, rather than every species, still leaves thousands of animals on board a vessel of finite space. The behavioral requirements of these animals are not uniform. Predators would require separation from prey. Nocturnal and diurnal animals would create conflicting environmental pressures. Animals adapted to specific climates, temperatures, humidity levels, and light conditions would require conditions that cannot all be replicated simultaneously in a single enclosed space. The text offers no mechanism for any of this. The theological narrative is told without the engineering specifications that literal history would require. The food and waste logistics compound the problem in ways that scale rapidly. A single elephant consumes hundreds of pounds of vegetation per day. A single large carnivore requires significant quantities of fresh meat at regular intervals. Multiply this across thousands of animals for a voyage that lasted, by the text's own account, over a year in total duration, and the required food storage alone exceeds the vessel's described capacity by orders of magnitude. The waste produced by thousands of animals in an enclosed space creates conditions that would be biologically dangerous to the animals themselves, without sophisticated ventilation, drainage, and cleaning systems that the ancient world did not possess and the text does not describe. The flood geology questions are equally pointed. A global flood capable of covering the highest mountains, including Everest at over 29,000 feet, would require an amount of water that does not exist on or near the Earth's surface. Atmospheric water, oceanic water, and all proposed underground reservoirs combined do not account for the volume that would be required. Furthermore, a flood of that magnitude would produce geological evidence of a very specific kind: massive, chaotic, globally uniform sedimentary deposits showing evidence of sudden catastrophic deposition. What geologists actually observe is a complex, layered geological record showing evidence of processes operating over vast timescales in diverse environments, not a single catastrophic event. The testimony dimension of Hume's framework is the most philosophically pointed application. The Ark story reaches us through a single textual tradition. There is no independent contemporary corroboration of a global flood from any of the sophisticated civilizations that were flourishing at the time the flood is supposed to have occurred. Egyptian civilization, which maintained detailed records across this period, shows no discontinuity consistent with a global flood that killed every human being outside Noah's family. Chinese civilization, Mesopotamian civilization, and Indus Valley civilization all show continuity across the period. This absence of corroborating testimony from literate contemporary civilizations is precisely the kind of evidential vacuum that Hume's framework treats as significant. What Hume would ask, applying his principle with full rigor, is this. On one side of the scale, we have the testimony of a single ancient textual tradition, filtered through oral transmission, theological editing, and centuries of institutional interpretation, describing an event of cosmic scope. On the other side of the scale, we have the uniform testimony of geology, biology, ecology, archaeology, and the documentary silence of every literate contemporary civilization. Which side is heavier? For Hume, there is no honest way to answer that question in favor of the literal ark without first abandoning the principle that rational belief requires proportioning evidence to claims. And abandoning that principle, he would argue, is not faith. It is the suspension of reason at exactly the moment reason is most needed. The implication that Hume's framework generates when applied to the Ark story is not primarily a conclusion about boats or animals or ancient floods. It is a conclusion about the relationship between meaning and evidence. And that conclusion is genuinely dangerous to a specific kind of institutional religion, not because it destroys faith, but because it separates what faith means from what faith has been made to do. The dangerous implication is this: a story can be spiritually profound, morally serious, and culturally central without being a literal record of physical events. And if that is true of the Ark, the question of where else it might be true cannot be sealed off indefinitely. For traditions built on the premise that Scripture must be defended in its entirety as literal history, this implication creates a structural crisis. The logic of biblical inerrancy does not easily permit selective literalism. If the Ark is mythic theology rather than history, then the mechanism that required the literal reading, the doctrine of total scriptural accuracy, has failed in a visible and specific case. And once that failure is visible, the next question is obvious. What else in the text has been defended as literal history for institutional rather than evidential reasons? This is the question that the defenders of literal readings cannot easily answer, and it is the question that Hume's framework makes unavoidable. The danger to dogmatic authority is equally precise. If the test for a doctrine is not, does it survive evidential scrutiny? But rather, does the institution require it? Then the institution has placed itself above inquiry. And Hume's entire philosophical project was an argument against that kind of intellectual submission. He believed deeply and seriously that reason must remain sovereign over authority, including religious authority. Not because religion has nothing to offer, but because authority that cannot survive scrutiny is not serving the people who trust it. It is serving itself. The institutional investment in the literal ark is not primarily about the ark. It is about maintaining the authority structure that the ark, taken literally, supports. There is a deeper implication still, one that touches not just institutions, but individual believers. If you were raised to believe that your eternal standing before God depended in part on your willingness to accept the ark as literal history, then examining the evidence is not an intellectual exercise. It is a spiritual risk, and that is precisely how the belief has often been framed in the communities that defend it most vigorously. Doubt becomes moral failure. Questions become spiritual danger. This dynamic, Hume would argue, is not the sign of a belief that is confident in its own truth. It is the sign of a belief that knows it cannot survive free examination and has therefore built a wall of fear around the act of asking. The implication for the ordinary believer sitting with this investigation is perhaps the most important of all. Hume's framework does not ask you to abandon spirituality. It does not ask you to abandon the emotional truth of the story, the beauty of the covenant, the power of the rainbow, or the moral seriousness of the narrative. What it asks is something more modest and more difficult, that you stop conflating meaning with evidence, and that you stop treating the defense of an unlikely literal claim as equivalent to the defense of your relationship with the sacred. Those are not the same thing. They have been made to feel like the same thing, but they are not. The final dangerous implication is perhaps the one that institutions fear most, because it is the most liberating. If the Ark story can be taken seriously as mythic theology without being taken literally as history, then the text becomes richer, not poorer. It can be read as a profound reflection on divine sovereignty, human fragility, and the nature of covenant without needing to be defended against paleontology. It can be examined honestly by a person of genuine faith without that person feeling that their examination is an act of betrayal. The danger to dogma is real. The liberation for the individual is equally real. And for Hume, that liberation was not the enemy of truth. It was the precondition for it. The literal reading of the Ark story became useful in ways that extend far beyond individual theology. At the institutional level, it became a test case for scriptural authority. If the faithful can be persuaded to accept and defend the literal Ark story, the habit of accepting and defending extraordinary claims on the basis of institutional authority rather than independent evidence is reinforced. The literal Ark is not the only claim that requires this habit. It is one of the most demanding of them, and successfully training a community to defend it prepares that community to accept a wide range of other claims that might not survive independent scrutiny. The story also became useful as a boundary marker. Communities under cultural pressure from surrounding societies often sharpen their identity by taking positions that distinguish them from outsiders. In the context of modern scientific culture, accepting evolution, deep time geology, and cosmological history has become normative outside certain religious communities. Explicitly rejecting those positions, partly on the grounds that the literal Ark requires it, functions as a signal of belonging. The person who defends the literal Ark in a secular context is performing community loyalty. They are demonstrating that their faith comes before scientific consensus. That performance matters enormously for community cohesion, even when the cost is intellectual isolation. The educational networks built around literal creationism, including homeschool curricula, Christian schools, creation museums, and apologetics ministries, represent a significant institutional infrastructure with a direct stake in the literal reading. These institutions do not exist because the evidence compelled them. They exist because a community committed to certain theological premises needed to educate its children in a way that was consistent with those premises. The Ark story is not incidental to this educational ecosystem. It is one of its central exhibits. Creation museums feature detailed reconstructions of the Ark. Apologetics training programs teach people to defend its logistics. The literal reading is not just taught, it is celebrated. The psychological usefulness of the belief is also significant. For people who experience the modern world as threatening to their faith, defending the literal Ark can provide a sense of intellectual courage, a sense of standing against consensus because Scripture demands it. This is not cynical. The experience of standing against what the majority believes for the sake of something you hold sacred has genuine psychological and spiritual meaning. It creates community solidarity and individual resilience. The problem is not that this experience is false. The problem is that it requires the individual to experience intellectual honesty as the enemy of faith rather than its companion. Finally, the literal Ark became politically useful in the late 20th and early 21st centuries as part of a broader movement to challenge the teaching of evolutionary science in public schools and to position biblical creationism as a legitimate scientific alternative. The Ark functions as a narrative anchor for this movement because it requires a specific geological and biological history that directly contradicts the mainstream scientific consensus. Defending it in public life is not just a religious act. It becomes a political one, tied to questions about education, science policy, and the role of religious authority in public institutions. The psychological effect of being raised to defend the literal Ark as a matter of spiritual obligation is not neutral, and it is worth examining with the same honesty we have brought to the historical and philosophical dimensions of this investigation. The core psychological structure created by literal Ark defense is this: doubt becomes dangerous, not intellectually inconvenient, not spiritually challenging in a productive way. Dangerous, because if the Ark must be literally true, and if the evidence against it is presented to you as a spiritual test rather than as honest information, then your willingness to dismiss that evidence becomes a measure of your faith. You learn to experience intellectual honesty as spiritual weakness. This creates a specific kind of cognitive pattern that psychologists studying religious cognition have documented in communities organized around inerrancy. When evidence conflicts with a required belief, the believer is trained not to examine the conflict openly, but to seek an explanation that preserves the required belief. This is sometimes called motivated reasoning. It is not unique to religion. Human beings engage in it across many domains, but in communities where the required beliefs are explicitly tied to eternal consequences, the motivation to avoid uncomfortable conclusions is especially powerful. The person who begins to find the Ark's logistics genuinely difficult is not simply experiencing an intellectual puzzle. They are experiencing what feels like a threat to their salvation, their community, and their identity. The shame dimension of this dynamic deserves specific attention. Many people who were raised in communities defending the literal Ark carry a specific kind of shame around their private doubts. They may have sat in Sunday school thinking, "But where did all the water go?" They may have calculated, even as children, that something about the numbers did not work, and they may have learned, through social signals rather than explicit instruction, that these questions were spiritually suspect. The child who asks uncomfortable questions about the Ark is not typically rewarded for intellectual curiosity. The child who accepts the story without question is. That reward structure shapes adults who have been practicing the suppression of honest inquiry for decades. The fear of a cascading theological collapse is another powerful psychological mechanism. Many believers in the literal ark have been told explicitly that if one story in Scripture is not literally true, the entire structure of faith comes down. This is sometimes called the domino argument, and it functions as a containment strategy. If each story must be defended literally because losing any one of them destroys everything, then the psychological cost of examining any story becomes catastrophically high. The ark becomes the lever that holds up the entire edifice, and the person who examines it is not just questioning a boat. They are, in the framing they have inherited, threatening the entire structure of meaning that their life is built on. What this psychological examination reveals is that the resistance to questioning the literal ark is not primarily about evidence. It is about what Hume himself understood to be the deepest driver of belief maintenance: the emotional and social costs of changing your mind. Hume recognized that human beings rarely change their beliefs through pure reasoning. They change them when the emotional conditions allow it. When the social cost of holding the belief becomes higher than the social cost of releasing it. When the relief of intellectual honesty becomes more powerful than the fear of communal disapproval. When they find intellectual companionship in the examination rather than isolation. That is precisely what this investigation is attempting to offer. We have traveled a significant distance from the wooden vessel and the paired animals of a childhood story. We began with an image that most of us encountered before we had the tools to examine it, a story told with such confidence and such cultural authority that questioning it felt, for many of us, less like thinking and more like sinning. We have now seen that behind that confidence lies a complex history of mythic parallel traditions, institutional investment, social identity management, and a psychological architecture carefully designed to make honest examination feel like spiritual betrayal. What Hume gives us is not a weapon against the story. It is a standard, an honest, rigorous, patient standard for what it means to believe something on the basis of evidence rather than on the basis of authority. And when the ark story is measured against that standard, the honest result is not that the story is worthless. It is that the story has been asked to carry a weight it was never designed to carry. The literalist reading did not originate with the original authors of Genesis. It originated with a specific theological and institutional tradition that needed Scripture to function as a substitute for investigation, and that tradition served itself as much as it served the people in its care. The transformation this investigation is tracking is not from belief to disbelief. It is from unreflective inheritance to conscious examination. The person who can read the Ark story, know its mythic parallels in the Epic of Gilgamesh, understand Hume's principle about extraordinary evidence, acknowledge the geological and biological difficulties, and still find something meaningful in the narrative of divine judgment, mercy, and covenant, that person is engaging with their tradition at a far deeper and more honest level than the person who was simply told never to ask. The examined faith and the examined doubt are both more serious than the unexamined compliance. This is what the channel you are watching is built to offer. Not easy answers, not cheap demolition of things people hold sacred. The heretic lens exists to do exactly what the best scholarship and the most courageous philosophy have always done. Open the archive, turn on the light, and examine what is actually there. If you have found this investigation valuable, If this is the kind of forbidden inquiry you want to accompany you further into the questions you have carried privately for years, subscribing to this channel ensures that you will not miss what comes next. Because the Ark is only one file in a very large archive, and the archive is not close to empty. The subscriber who stays with this channel is not someone who wants simple answers or reassuring conclusions. They are someone who has decided that the examined life extends to the examined faith, and that the courage to ask was never the enemy of the sacred. It was always the beginning of a more honest relationship with it. The work continues. The archive remains open, and every question you were told not to ask is exactly the question that belongs on this table. The movement from the sacred childhood story to the evidential crisis is not a story of loss. Or rather, it is a story of loss only if you accept the premise that the only way to hold the Ark is to hold it literally. But that premise was never required by the story itself. It was required by the institutions that needed the story to be history. And institutions, as Hume would remind us, are not the same as truth. The case against the literal Ark, assembled from multiple disciplines, constitutes some of the strongest convergent evidence available in any historical or scientific investigation. When multiple independent lines of inquiry point toward the same conclusion without coordination, the cumulative weight of that convergence is significant. In this case, geology, biology, ecology, archaeology, comparative mythology, and naval engineering all point in the same direction. They do not all arrive at that conclusion for the same reasons or through the same methods, but they arrive together. And that convergence is not something that can be dismissed by adjusting one variable. The geological evidence is perhaps the most straightforward. If a global flood of the scope described in Genesis occurred within the last 10,000 years, it would have left a specific and unmistakable geological signature. A massive, globally distributed layer of flood sediment deposited rapidly and uniformly across the surface of the Earth. No such layer exists. What geologists find instead is a complex, layered geological record with evidence of diverse depositional environments operating across vastly different timescales, ranging from volcanic formations to desert sandstones to marine limestones, each indicating conditions radically different from a single global inundation. The Grand Canyon, often cited by young Earth creationists as flood evidence, is instead one of the clearest illustrations of the problem, because its layers represent environments including shallow seas, desert dunes, and river deltas that cannot all be explained by a single flood event. The biological evidence adds a separate and equally powerful layer. The theory of evolution, confirmed by genetics, paleontology, anatomy, and direct observation, requires timescales that are incompatible with a young Earth and a global flood of recent origin. The genetic diversity of the human population alone, as measured by molecular biology, indicates a history that extends hundreds of thousands of years without a genetic bottleneck consistent with all of humanity, descending from 8 survivors within the last several thousand years. The diversity of domesticated and wild species shows a similar pattern. The genetic distances between populations are consistent with long separation, not recent common origin from a single preserved group. The ecological evidence concerns the post-flood distribution problem that is perhaps the most difficult challenge for the literal reading. Biogeography, the study of where species are found and why, reveals patterns of distribution that are perfectly consistent with evolutionary descent from geographically separated ancestral populations, and profoundly inconsistent with post-flood migration from a single point of origin in the Near East. The unique fauna of Australia, Madagascar, the Galapagos Islands, and countless island ecosystems represent populations that could not have traveled from a landing point in the mountains of the Near East without leaving evidence of their passage across intervening land masses. That evidence does not exist. The comparative mythological evidence takes the conversation in a different direction, but arrives at the same destination. The existence of flood narratives across many cultures has been used to argue for a universal memory of a real global flood. But the comparative record actually suggests something more nuanced and more illuminating. Flood myths are overwhelmingly concentrated in river valley and coastal civilizations, where catastrophic local flooding was a real and recurring experience. The specific details of flood narratives across cultures differ significantly in ways inconsistent with independent memory of a single shared event, but converge structurally in ways consistent with a shared genre of sacred narrative about divine power, human vulnerability, and survival. The parallel between Noah and Utnapishtim is evidence not of a global flood, but of a shared narrative tradition. The archaeological evidence is perhaps the most uncomfortable for the literal reading. The complete absence of disruption in the historical record of civilizations that would necessarily have been destroyed by a global flood of recent date. The Egyptian civilization maintained continuous records across the period when the Ark is supposed to have been the only surviving vessel on Earth. No flood layer in the Egyptian stratigraphy. No gap in the pharaonic record consistent with the elimination of the entire Egyptian population. The same is true of the Akkadian civilization, the early Indus Valley civilization, and the late Neolithic cultures of China, all of which show continuity across the proposed flood period. The silence of these civilizations on the event of all events is not a minor evidentiary gap. It is a vast, echoing absence. It would be dishonest to proceed without presenting the strongest defense of the literal Ark reading, and doing so requires taking it seriously on its own terms, rather than reducing it to a caricature. The most powerful defense is not a denial of the logical difficulties. It is a theological reframing of what the story is asking the reader to accept. The defense begins with the premise that if the God described in Genesis is real, then the logical difficulties of the Ark story are not problems for God. They are problems only for human beings reasoning within the constraints of natural law. A God who created the universe from nothing, who designed the laws of physics, biology, and ecology, is not constrained by those laws. Miracle is not the introduction of magic into a closed system. It is the sovereign action of the author of the system. This is a coherent theological position, and it should not be dismissed. Within a theistic framework where God is understood as omnipotent and ontologically prior to the natural order, the appeal to divine miracle is not an evasion. It is a claim about the nature of the universe. If God exists and is omnipotent, then the logistics of the Ark are simply not the problem that Hume's naturalistic framework presents them as. The water problem is solved by divine provision. The food problem is solved by divine provision. The behavioral problems of predators and prey in close proximity are solved by divine intervention. The post-flood distribution of species is solved by divine guidance. Within this framework, the critic who raises logistical objections is not scoring philosophical points. They are simply failing to take the theistic premise seriously. The defense also appeals to the limits of human understanding. The argument goes like this: we cannot know what additional mechanisms God may have employed that the text does not describe. Perhaps certain animals were in a state of divinely induced hibernation. Perhaps the genetic diversity we observe today was compressed into smaller ancestral populations and then expanded by divinely accelerated variation. Perhaps the flood was a regional event that the text describes in cosmic terms for theological rather than geographical reasons, a literary convention of the ancient Near East that the original audience would have understood. Each of these moves represents a serious theological and hermeneutical tradition that has been developed by scholars working within the believing community. The appeal to textual interpretation also carries real weight. Some serious biblical scholars within the theological tradition argue that the insistence on a strict global literal reading is itself a relatively recent development, not the only or even the most ancient understanding of the text. Augustine of Hippo, one of the most influential theologians in Christian history, warned against a simplistic literal reading of Genesis that would embarrass Christians before non-believers. The allegorical and typological reading of the Ark has a long and distinguished history in Christian theology, predating modern biblical criticism. The defense of the literal reading as the only faithful reading therefore oversimplifies the actual diversity of Christian interpretive tradition. Finally, the defense appeals to the limits of science itself. Science, in this argument, operates within a naturalistic framework that excludes by methodological assumption the very possibility of divine intervention. It is therefore not surprising that science cannot confirm miracle. The tools of science are designed to detect patterns in nature, not to detect the fingerprints of a God who operates above nature. Asking science to confirm the Ark is like asking a metal detector to confirm the existence of wood. The absence of naturalistic evidence for a miraculous event is not evidence against the miracle. It is simply a reflection of the methodological scope of the scientific enterprise. The objection from divine omnipotence is philosophically coherent, but Hume's response to it is precise and does not require dismissing the possibility of God. Hume's argument is not about what God can do. It is about what testimony can establish. Even if we grant, for the sake of argument, that an omnipotent God could have managed every logistical difficulty of the Ark by miraculous intervention, this concession does not improve the evidential situation. It makes it worse, because every logistical difficulty that requires a miraculous solution increases the number of miracles the literal reading depends on, and every additional miracle is an additional extraordinary claim that requires extraordinary evidence. Invoking omnipotence does not reduce the evidential burden. It multiplies it. The point can be stated very simply. If the Ark story required one miracle, it would require one very strong piece of evidence. If it required 50 miracles, each of which left no physical trace, it requires 50 very strong pieces of evidence, or one piece of evidence so powerful that it accounts for all 50 simultaneously. The evidential record, as we have examined it, provides nothing close to this. It provides the testimony of a single ancient text, with no independent contemporary corroboration, describing an event that would have been witnessed and recorded by multiple sophisticated civilizations that left no such record. The invocation of miracle to explain each logistical gap is not a solution to the evidential problem. It is a restatement of it. The methodological objection, the claim that science cannot detect miracles by design, is also true, but cuts both ways. If science cannot detect the miracle of the flood because God intervened in ways that deliberately bypass natural mechanisms and leave no trace, then the claim that the flood is historical is not a scientific claim. It is a purely faith-based claim. And purely faith-based claims about historical events cannot be used as the basis for institutional authority over what people are required to believe about history, biology, geology, or education. You cannot simultaneously claim that the Ark is literal history and that the historical evidence for it is inaccessible to historical methods. That position is self-defeating. The diversity of Christian interpretive tradition, which the defense rightly invokes, is actually a significant problem for the institutions most loudly defending the literal reading. If Augustine could be a serious Christian without insisting on a strict global literal flood, and if allegorical and typological readings of the Ark have a distinguished theological pedigree, then the claim that the literal reading is the only faithful reading is itself a historical overreach. The defenders of the literal Ark are not defending the oldest or the only tradition of reading. They are defending a specific, relatively recent, and institutionally motivated tradition of reading that became dominant in certain communities for reasons we have examined. That is a very different thing from defending Scripture itself. The deepest reason why the problem remains after every objection is considered can be stated in a single observation: a belief system that protects its central claims from examination by surrounding them with invocations of miracle, appeals to divine inscrutability, and warnings that inquiry is spiritually dangerous, has not answered the question of whether the claims are true. It has simply made the question harder to ask. And Hume's enduring contribution to the philosophy of religion is the insistence that the difficulty of asking a question is not evidence that the answer is yes. The Ark story remains under honest examination, a story that functions magnificently as mythic theology and fails, by any standard of historical evidence, as literal history. No amount of theological creativity changes what the physical record says or does not say. What happens to a person when they have genuinely looked at the Ark story through the lens we have been using? Something shifts. But it does not shift in the direction that the defenders of the literal reading predict. They predict collapse. If the Ark is not literal history, then God is not real. Scripture is worthless, morality has no foundation, and life has no meaning. This prediction, endlessly repeated as a warning against examination, is simply false. What actually happens when a person moves through this examination honestly is something more interesting and more complicated. The Ark story does not become meaningless after examination. It becomes different. It becomes, for many people, more rather than less resonant, because they can now engage with it as what it most likely is: a profound piece of ancient theological storytelling in a tradition that includes some of the most searching reflections on human nature, divine justice, and the relationship between creation and creator, ever committed to language. Reading it as myth, in the serious sense of that word, a narrative that encodes cultural memory, theological insight, and existential meaning, is not a diminishment. It is an elevation. The myth does not need to be a newspaper account to be true in the ways that matter most. The perception of Scripture changes as well. For many people raised in the literalist tradition, the experience of examining the Ark is the beginning of learning to read Scripture as literature rather than as a legal document. This is not a radical or irreligious way of reading. It is, as the history of biblical scholarship shows, a way of reading that has a distinguished pedigree going back to ancient readers who understood that sacred texts operate through metaphor, symbol, and narrative in ways that resist simple fact-checking. The person who emerges from this examination with a more literary understanding of Genesis is not a worse reader of Scripture. They may well be a better one. The figure of Noah himself undergoes a transformation under honest examination. Taken literally, he is a historical figure whose existence raises questions we cannot answer. Taken as a theological character, he becomes something richer, a portrait of faithful persistence in the face of a world that has lost its moral bearings, a figure who builds what he cannot yet see the need for, who trusts beyond the available evidence, who cares for what has been entrusted to him, even in conditions of extreme precariousness. These are not small ideas. They are ideas that a person of serious faith or serious humanism can find genuinely nourishing without needing to believe that a man once gathered every species of beetle into a boat. The relationship between the viewer and their inherited tradition changes in a specific way after this examination. The institution that required the literal reading loses some of its authority because it has been shown to be a relatively recent, ideologically motivated interpreter rather than the transparent vessel of ancient truth it presented itself as. But the tradition itself, the long, complex, internally diverse tradition of people who have read and argued with and been changed by the text of Genesis, does not lose its interest. If anything, it becomes more interesting, because its complexity and its disagreements are now visible. The person who thought they were inheriting a simple, unanimous ancient truth discovers instead a living, contested, richly argumentative tradition. That discovery is not loss, it is arrival. What the examination of the literal ark story does not mean is that religion is nothing but manipulation, or that all believers are victims of institutional dishonesty, or that the text of Genesis is worthless because it cannot be defended as geology. None of these conclusions follow from what has been established here. The critique of institutional literalism is a critique of a specific interpretive tradition and the power structures that maintain it. It is not a verdict on every form of faith, every expression of spirituality, or every human being who has found meaning in the sacred story of Noah. It also does not mean that the question of God is settled. Hume's critique of miracle testimony and extraordinary claims is a challenge to specific historical assertions. It is not a proof that the universe is indifferent or that transcendence is an illusion. Some of the most rigorous and honest philosophers in history have been theists who also took evidential standards seriously. The examination of a specific claim that a wooden boat carried every species of animal through a global flood does not resolve the larger metaphysical questions about the nature of reality, consciousness, or the origin of the universe. Those questions remain open in ways that honest inquiry must acknowledge. What this investigation also does not mean is that people who defended the literal ark were stupid, or cowardly, or simply deceived. The communities that maintained the literal reading were communities of real human beings trying to hold their lives together inside a framework of meaning that gave them coherence, purpose, and belonging. The belief served genuine human needs, and the people inside it were not simply passive recipients of institutional manipulation. They were full human beings whose relationship with the sacred was real, even if the specific historical claim they were asked to defend was not. Intellectual honesty does not require contempt for the honestly mistaken. It requires the capacity to make distinctions. Finally, what this does not mean is that the work of examination is finished. The ark story is one entry in a vast archive of inherited beliefs that have never been examined with the honesty they deserve. Each one of those beliefs has a history, an institutional purpose, a psychological effect, and a set of questions it was never designed to face. The examination of one does not complete the examination of all. What it does is demonstrate that the examination is possible, that it can be done without cruelty, and that what remains after honest inquiry is not emptiness, but clarity. What becomes possible after the literal scaffolding around the ark story has been examined honestly is something that the institutions defending that scaffolding could not offer: the freedom to engage with the text on terms that do not require intellectual dishonesty. This is not a small gift. For people who were raised inside traditions that made doubt a sin and questions a spiritual danger, the realization that the text itself does not require the literalist reading, that serious, historically grounded, theologically sophisticated scholars have read the Ark as mythic theology for centuries without betraying their faith, can be genuinely liberating, not because it solves every question, but because it lifts a specific and unjust burden. The freedom that follows examination is not the freedom of indifference. The person who has examined the Ark story and released the need to defend it literally is not free because they no longer care. They are free because they can care more honestly. They can engage with the genuine theological questions the story raises about justice, about mercy, about the nature of divine relationship with creation, without having to simultaneously defend an implausible historical claim against the entire body of geological and biological evidence. That is a different and more serious engagement with the text than the one they were offered before. There is also a freedom that becomes available at the level of community. The person who can distinguish between the mythic power of a story and the institutional requirement to defend it literally is in a position to participate in religious community on terms of genuine intellectual engagement rather than required compliance. They may choose to remain in their tradition. They may choose to leave it. They may find new traditions or new ways of holding the questions that tradition was trying to answer. But whatever they choose it with open eyes rather than closed ones. And that is a dignity that the institutions requiring the literal reading rarely offered. The deepest freedom that emerges from this investigation is the freedom to take ancient texts seriously as ancient texts, to read them with awareness of their historical context, their literary conventions, their theological purposes, and their cultural origins, without needing to defend them against a standard they were never designed to meet. The author of the Genesis flood narrative was not writing a geological survey. They were wrestling with enormous questions about divine justice, cosmic catastrophe, and the survival of meaning in the face of destruction. Those are real questions. They deserve serious engagement, and they get it more richly from a reader who brings historical and philosophical awareness to the text than from a reader who has been trained to accept it without question. The philosopher Hume did not offer freedom from religion. He offered something more precise and more useful: freedom from the compulsion to believe without evidence. For many people, especially those raised in traditions that tied their moral worth to their willingness to accept claims that could not be questioned, that freedom is among the most profound things that a philosophical encounter can offer. You were not wrong to doubt. The doubt was not a spiritual failure. It was an act of intellectual integrity, performing itself in conditions that made intellectual integrity extremely costly. And now, on the other side of the examination, a more honest way of being in relationship with the questions that matter most remains available to you. A wooden vessel was asked to carry the memory of the world through catastrophe. And perhaps it did, though not in the way we were taught. Perhaps the Ark carries not a biological inventory, but a theological one. The memory of a world that feared cosmic destruction. The testimony of human beings reaching for meaning at the edge of everything they knew. The image of one person building against the darkness because something, call it God or conscience or desperate hope, insisted that it was worth it. That vessel is not diminished by the examination. It is revealed, not as history, necessarily, but as something older and stranger and more enduring than history. The human refusal to to let catastrophe have the final word. The question that remains after everything examined here is one that only you can answer for yourself, and it is worth sitting with honestly. How do you read the story of Noah's Ark? Is it literal history that requires a global flood and a real vessel of specific dimensions? Is it a divine miracle beyond evidential examination? Is it a mythic narrative carrying theological truth without factual claim? Or is it something else entirely? A symbol, a memory, a metaphor, a sacred fiction that points towards something real without being real itself? Leave your answer in the comments below, because the conversation that happens in that space is part of what this investigation is actually for.